Yeah, out of hundreds of requests, TIE Fighter's actually the most requested game at the moment, so I'll definitely be getting to it soon enough. So, Star Wars X-Wing. You might think that there's not really too much to say about this game that hasn't been said before, but one thing I can safely say about it that I seriously doubt anyone else has said is that, as far as nostalgia is concerned, it's a lot like Abuse. Yeah, that run-and-gun platformer I covered not too many episodes ago. You see, Abuse was a game that people have fond memories of, but anybody who actually goes back and tries playing it again generally ends up frustrated and annoyed and ends up chucking their mouse clear across the room. X-Wing, it's not quite like that. Usually it's a joystick, not a mouse. People tend to have fond memories of playing this game because it was cinematic, it had intense action, a huge number of missions, but holy cripes is this game frustrating and time-consuming. Even with a full week to play this game, I always keep running into the same problems after many minutes into a mission, requiring me to do the entire mission all over again, only to run into the same problem again and again and again. As a result, I can't really get far enough to show much of what this game has to offer, and I'm not about to spend several months trying to take advantage of quirks in the game to get through 30 plus missions. So, I'll do my best to give this game a fair look-see, and as usual, let's start with the game stats. X-Wing was developed and published by LucasArts in 1993 and is a one-player, first-person action simulation game. It only supports VGA 320x200 256 color graphics, but a wide array of sound and music devices. While it's simplest to choose the Sound Blaster support, I imagine if you've got the necessary hardware or emulation layers, some of the other devices might actually sound better for the music. As for its current release date, it's still commercial, and finding a copy is an interesting prospect. But don't get me wrong, it's really easy to find an inexpensive copy. The question is which copy you end up getting. The version I'm playing is the original floppy disk version, which is also the hardest to find nowadays. Following this were two CD-ROM releases, one in 1994 and another in 1998. Both of which are called the Collector's CD-ROM, and in fact it's extremely easy to confuse those two versions with each other. The 94 release uses the TIE Fighter engine, relaxes some of the difficulty, and has a lot more voice work, while the 98 release is a Windows exclusive title because it uses the same game engine as X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter. This is not helped by the fact that a lot of people selling this game online use stock images of the box or disc. The only way you're going to tell the difference is to actually ask the seller if the X-Wing logo on the disc itself is silver or gold. If it's silver, it's the 94 version for DOS. If it's gold, it's the 98 version for Windows. The story for this game starts off a bit before the Battle of Yavin, which, if you're a little rusty on Star Wars lore, is the battle where the first Death Star gets destroyed. You take command of a rookie pilot, rising the ranks as you help to win battles for the Rebellion against the Galactic Empire, culminating in 3 tours of duty, which you can play in any order. The first tour of duty revolves around finding new allies and destroying Imperial supplies and ships. The second tour of duty revolves around finding the plans to the Death Star and delivering them to Princess Leia. The third tour is where the rebels amass their fleet and prepare for the attack on the Death Star itself. And you do actually get to do the trench run if you can make it that far. Getting anywhere in this game, though, is going to take a ton of practice because there is a very steep learning curve, mostly to do with the controls. Because this game tries to be more like a simulation rather than a typical space shooter, there are a plethora of commands for doing things such as targeting, looking around your cockpit, adjusting energy distribution, issuing commands to wingmen, and more. Heck, if you're flying an X-Wing, you can even open and close the S-foils at will, which is kind of pointless since you can't fire your weapons when they're closed, nor do you get any benefits from doing so. Yet, despite the X-Wing getting top billing for this game, you actually get a lot of flight time in Y-Wings and A-Wings as well. That said, the X-Wing is definitely the most powerful ship on display in this game, with good speed, the best shielding, 4 laser cannons to blast your enemies with, and a complement of 6 proton torpedoes, which are really powerful homing weapons. The A-Wing, on the other hand, is the fastest and the smallest of the ships, meaning it's really easy to dodge attacks with it, but it's limited to only 2 laser cannons and a complement of 12 concussion missiles, which aren't as effective as proton torpedoes, but otherwise serve the same purpose. The A-Wing's small size also means it uses a high-end navigational computer in place of an astro droid, which means you need to pay a little more attention to all the blinking lights and messages that pop up to know what's going on. And then you have the Y-Wing, which is slow and poorly shielded, but it also has ion cannons, which don't do much in the way of damage, but can completely disable a larger ship far faster than trying to destroy it with standard weapons. And it has 8 proton torpedoes, useful for bombing runs against hardened targets. Getting the most out of the Y-Wing means switching between these weapon systems to ensure energy isn't being wasted in useless recharging. Yeah, that's one thing you've got to master ASAP is energy distribution. You have a special ELS gauge showing the colors blue, red, and green, indicating how much power is allocated to your engines, lasers, and shields. And you only directly control the rates for lasers and shields, and the engines get whatever power is left over. If lasers or shields are balanced, they recharge incredibly slowly, so in order to get any more power into them, you're going to have to raise the energy level of at least one of them, since you can instantly transfer energy from the lasers to the shields or vice versa. If lasers or shields are below balanced, they actually lose energy. Suffice to say, there are very few circumstances where you would want these below balanced. Well, there is one thing an advanced player can do. Lasers recharge faster than shields in this game for the same energy setting, despite the fact that energy transfers equally between lasers and shields. So if you increase the laser energy level but decrease the shield energy level, then simply transfer laser energy to the shields when the lasers are full, you actually end up with a net increase in overall energy levels, without having to sacrifice engine power. This is a pretty advanced tactic though, so I don't recommend it until you get very accustomed to transferring energy between lasers and shields. Back on the control side of things though, you really need a joystick to play this game. The simple fact is that the keyboard controls don't ramp fast enough to perform quick maneuvers, and the mouse control is an absolute joke. If you don't have a joystick or gamepad, then use Dosbox's keymapper to remap the keyboard's arrow keys to joystick functions and pretend that your arrow keys are a joystick. Heck, the later Windows game X-Wing vs. TIE Fighter didn't even allow keyboard control. You absolutely had to have a joystick. Granted, even the joystick controls in this game are very temperamental. Because the game is using integer math, not floating point math, something as simple as turning your ship actually results in a slight, unpredictable angle to the direction you actually want to turn it, which can be very difficult to get used to. Worse still is there's almost a full second of drift once you center your joystick again, meaning it's incredibly difficult to center something in your view, not helped by how tiny most of the enemies are to begin with. I know, I've mostly talked about the controls so far, but it really is the second biggest issue this game has. I admire the effort LucasArts put into making this game feel like you were actually in one of these starfighters, such as the varying cockpit designs, the dynamic damage modeling, even the energy allocation. But there's simply way too many controls for what shouldn't have been any more complicated than point and shoot, and even that aspect has a number of quirks to it. You see, something that we as gamers take for granted in modern games are lead indicators. And a lead indicator is a symbol which appears on a heads-up display to indicate where you need to aim to hit something based on how fast that something is moving and what direction it's moving in. Star Wars X-Wing doesn't have a lead indicator. Instead, if you happen to be aiming at the exact spot you would need to shoot in to hit your target, your aiming reticle turns green and makes a sound. Combined with the tiny size of most of the enemies and the lack of weapon convergence, makes it extremely difficult to hit anything. Actually, another thing we take for granted in these kinds of games that didn't come about until TIE Fighter is speed matching. The idea is that it's far easier to keep a target in your sight so long as you're going the exact same speed. The original version of this game, however, doesn't have speed matching, so you're going to be passing by targets routinely and watching them pull away from you just as often. Unless you have the CD-ROM version, since, as far as I'm aware, that version does have speed matching. Now, before I get too far ahead of myself, let's quickly go over a bunch of the things you can do outside of the simulation aspect. Once you register your character, you don't have to go straight to a tour of duty. Instead, you can access the pilot proving grounds, the historical combat archives, the tech room, and the film room. The tech room lets you see the various technical specifications of the ships you can encounter in the game. The film room is where you can play back recordings you've saved of your gameplay, which is done with a replay system similar to what you would have in a modern racing game. The pilot proving grounds provides a special course you can fly through to practice your flying and aiming, and the historical combat archives gives you a set of 18 missions you can play anytime you want with no consequences if you lose one. Or you can also replay tour of duty missions that you've successfully completed. So yeah, even though it might seem like I don't like this game, and to be perfectly honest, I'm kind of on the fence about it, but for a 1993 space shooter, this game offers a massive quantity of gameplay and really does immerse you into the experience for the most part, especially with the way the music works, as it plays back various cues and tunes based on how a mission is progressing. For instance, when you defeat an enemy, you'll hear a particular little cue in the music. You'll also hear different cues for when enemies warp in, when friendlies warp in, when you complete your mission, or there's also a cue to let you know when you have no hope of winning a mission, so you'll probably want to learn what that one is, since most of the time the game won't actually tell you when you failed a mission. And you are going to be failing missions constantly, as we now come to the one major flaw of this game and the reason why my gameplay footage is mostly restricted to the pilot proving grounds and historical missions. Most of the missions in this game have escort objectives, i.e. make sure something friendly doesn't get destroyed. The crazy thing is, many of the missions in this game don't start this way, but they end up becoming escort missions before it's over. And unlike some games which offer you a little leeway with this, X-Wing gives you no leeway at all. Lose a single friendly target that needs protecting and you don't win the mission. Since many of the missions can take 15 minutes or more to play, and because there's over 3 dozen tour of duty missions, it takes many hours of gameplay just to get anywhere. This is why this game is so incredibly frustrating, because you can't just sit down, play it for a little, and get anywhere. You have to commit yourself to this game for an insane number of hours. Worse still, the game does offer built-in cheats such as invulnerability and unlimited weapons, but this only affects you and not your allies, which really isn't going to make any of the escort objectives any easier. I guess what I'm trying to say is that this is a fun game to play, just don't expect to get anywhere until you've mastered the heck out of it. And from what I'm told, the later CD-ROM versions are easier, but really, the only true way to make an escort objective any fun is to ensure that what you're escorting cannot be destroyed, because nothing sucks more than playing a mission for 15 minutes straight only to have the ship you're escorting destroyed 5 seconds before it would have left the area and finished the mission. I can't even begin to tell you the number of times this happened while trying to get anywhere in this game. So yeah, like a lot of the early Star Wars games, this one was definitely a step in the right direction. There's just a lot of things they could have done better. And when it came time to do TIE Fighter, they got a lot of those things right, and that probably explains why several people have requested TIE Fighter, and yet only one person has ever requested X-Wing. Anyways, before I talk Dosbox settings, I do have a few tips for any of you who do want to give this game a try. My first tip is to not play the floppy disk version. The DOS CD-ROM version uses a TIE Fighter engine, which is greatly improved over the original X-Wing engine, and offers speed matching among other things. So really, the only reason why you would want the floppy disk version is for sake of collecting or curiosity. My next tip, which is more of a real tip, is that if the mission objective requires you to disable a particular target, make absolutely sure you ID it first. To do this, target the ship or container you want to ID, then just run in extremely close and you identify it. The reason for this is that disabling a target is usually followed by another friendly ship intercepting that disabled target. But if it's the wrong disabled target, the friendly ship doing the intercept isn't going to go for the right ship, even if you disable it beforehand. Thankfully, once you know the codename of the right ship, you can get away with not IDing it in later attempts. Thirdly, try not to waste your missiles or torpedoes. You get very few of them, so the best time to use them is on weak ships at long range, on ships that you're trailing behind that are following a very predictable flight path, or on key targets that are going to escape if you don't shoot them down fast enough. Fourthly, if the enemy starts shooting at you, weave like crazy. The AI in this game is very bad at hitting targets that are moving erratically, so the simple act of rapidly changing the direction you're flying in will throw off a pursuer and likely leave you untouched by your weapons. Lastly, set yourself up with a good, high-end joystick and abuse Dosbox's keymapper as much as you possibly can to get the most out of it. I have my joystick set up in such a way that I can alter throttle, target enemies, rebalance my shields. Heck, I use the hat on my joystick entirely for energy distribution, with left hat changing lasers, right hat changing shields, up hat transferring shields to lasers, and down hat transferring lasers to shields. The only thing that disappoints me is that there aren't any roll left or right keys, so I can't map the twist function of my joystick to rolling the ship. Nor does the game support throttle control. Granted, TIE Fighter does, so if you have the CD-ROM version of X-Wing, you'll probably be able to do even more with your joystick than you can in the original. As for Dosbox settings, there's a few of them, but at least they're not too complicated. Just set the core to dynamic mode and the cycles to max and you should be good. Though if you're using a joystick, you also want to set the joystick type to FCS, particularly if you're using a hat or a throttle with your joystick. And you also want to turn timed intervals off and button wrap off. If you're playing the CD-ROM version, you may also want to create an ISO and image mounted in Dosbox for sake of simplicity. Now, I know TIE Fighter has SVGA graphics, but I don't actually have the DOS CD-ROM of X-Wing, so I don't know if it does or not. I'll be reviewing TIE Fighter in a few weeks, so if there's any special graphics settings that need to be applied for SVGA graphics, I'll talk about them then. Anyways, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week in episode 72, we're going to cover a game with an opening that's very reminiscent of the Terminator movies. But it's not actually a Terminator game. If you think you know which game is like that, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and tune in next Saturday to check it out.